Hello and welcome to this Fertility Network UK webinar for National Fertility Awareness Week 2021. I'm Rosa Glover from Fertility Network UK, and joining us today is Nina Barnsley, Director of Donor Conception Network. Nina, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Can we start with you telling us a little bit about Donor Conception Network?
Yes, of course. So the Donor Conception Network is a charity. It was founded about 30 years ago. We're coming up to our 30th anniversary. And it was started because people wanted to get together to support each other, people who were considering donor conception, so maybe sperm donation or egg donation, sometimes both, double donation. These days it could also be embryo donation, and it could be people using surrogacy as well.
Mm.
So the charity was bringing people together to help them work out, is this the right route for them? What are the implications? What do they need to think about? How can they make these complicated decisions? And then if they're successful, then the charity also provided support for people with their children, how to talk to children, how to explain this to friends and family, how to build a confidence as well, how to build confidence in yourself as a parent when you're parenting a child that you're perhaps not genetically connected to, and how to build confidence in talking about this family story so that you build a sort of climate of openness in the family so that children grow up always having known this is just part of who they are, and they don't have uh, 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 that sort of sense of something being withheld or a
Yeah.
secret being discovered later on. So it's a lot about support, openness, building confidence, and bringing people together to do that.
Oh, that's brilliant. So we seem to be talking more openly about donor conception nowadays. Do you think it's something that more people are considering?
Definitely, definitely. I mean, if you look at the numbers, and that's for two reasons. Well, for probably many reasons. I think one is that people are talking about it, so people know about the option.
Yeah.
I think the technology is also changing, and so that means that new techniques are available. I think also there are different demographics. So obviously for single people, for same-sex couples, they will have a sort of missing ingredient, if you like, maybe even more than one missing ingredient, and
Mm.
so there'll be no option for them unless they choose perhaps a co-parenting or adoption.
Yeah.
Then they will need to use donor conception. So with the sort of rise of all those families, plus I suppose people sort of starting their families later and finding that they're running into fertility issues, that might not have been such an issue if they'd if
Yeah.
the average age of starting a family was a bit younger. So all of those mean that there's more of it going on. And yes, I would hope that that's partly because the climate of openness means that people also feel comfortable talking about it, because that's so important.
Yeah. So for those who've had unsuccessful fertility treatment, using a donor is sometimes presented to be the next step on the journey. And what do you think are the considerations that people need to think about when they're, looking at donor conception?
I think, the way we would put it, or try to encourage people to think, and particularly to get the clinics to think like this, perhaps, is that it is different. There's sort of, you're on one track. If you're a heterosexual couple, you're trying to have a baby with your own sperm and eggs, and sustain that pregnancy, and get a baby at the end.
Mm.
And once you move on to a different, you can do all sorts of fertility treatments to try to make that happen. Once those haven't worked for whatever reason, or there's some kind of diagnosis that means, okay, you're clearly going to need to use an egg or sperm donor or both, then you're on a different path. There are different implications.
Mm.
And the implications are that you might well be raising a child you're not genetically connected to. The child's not genetically connected to you in that case. So that,
Yeah.
the implications go both ways. But certainly, you will be raising a child who is genetically connected to someone outside of the family raising them. And who is that person? What importance do they have in the family story? What importance will they have to you? What importance do they have to the child? What's
Yeah.
the sort of long-term projection of this? That person may have other children, either their own children or perhaps children they've helped to create in other donor conception families. Who are they? So there's a sort of a very different set of questions and things to consider for the future when you're using donor conception than if you're just using IVF or IUI or doing a whole range of fertility enhancing treatments to try your best to get pregnant with your own eggs and sperm.
Yeah.
And the same sort of considerations apply to same-sex couples. As well, because even though this is like a wonderful opportunity for many of them, where suddenly there is a way they can have a baby, but they still often would what they really want is to make a baby with the person they love,
Yeah.
and they can't do that. And also then there's a question of, like, if you're a gay couple, whose sperm are you going to use? Or you're going to
Mm.
have one baby with each sperm, each man's sperm. If you're a lesbian couple, who's going to carry the baby?
Yeah.
There are still quite complicated questions and implications for this. And so clinics really need to, I would say, need to recognize, or we need to sort of recognize, that there is a bit of a different part that has different things to think about. And although you're right, it is a sort of next step. I think it can sometimes be a little bit too quick as an option to bypass some of that thinking, and then that doesn't help people, because
Mm.
you want them to think about these things before they've got a baby, or certainly
Yeah.
before they get pregnant, rather than trying to sort of mop up some of those questions later on.
Yeah. It's almost like how quickly people suggest IVF
Yeah.
when natural conception doesn't work. It's kind of the same sort of change in, like you say, change in tack, change in route, isn't it? Yeah. And how important do you think is sort of counselling for people to go work through these decisions and these um, considerations before they go ahead?
I think it's really important, because sometimes I get the sense that people think that the counselling that's offered is it's like checking that they're
Oh,
psychologically okay to
right,
have a baby. It's like a gate, and they have to, or a test, they have to pass the
right.
test, and it really shouldn't be seen like that. It's an opportunity to dedicate some quality time, focus on this specific issue in a safe place with a qualified professional, hopefully hopefully a good
Yeah,
counsellor, and they can really. What you can do with a counsellor is you can say all the things you wouldn't dare say to your friends or family, perhaps all the sort of
yeah,
dark thoughts that you've got. And
yeah,
once you've said them, you can explore them. You can think, well, are they real, or are they just fears that once you've said them you realize actually it's not that big a deal.
yeah,
And for some people, they'll just need, they might just need to talk about it once, and other people may need quite a lot of counselling, because it depends how you feel about all of this, how you feel about genetics, how you feel about giving up your genetic material. It's complicated, but yes,
mm,
counselling can be brilliant.
yeah, great. So sadly, we hear there's a shortage of donors in the UK. What realistically is the time frame that people are looking at nowadays?
I think that varies enormously.
Okay.
Some clinics have got good donor recruitment programs, or have good links with donor banks. Others don't. It depends a little bit what you're looking for. So, for example, if you have a very specific matching criteria that is unusual, so for example, our members are using all sorts of different kinds of donors and have different feelings about what's important to them.
Mm,
So let's say you particularly want a Hindu donor,
mm,
so that's important to you culturally and religiously. You want
okay.
to have that connection, in your heritage, and you want it to be passed, that heritage to be passed to your child. And then the clinic that you go to doesn't have a Hindu donor.
Mm,
So what do you do then? The waiting list might be, as long as anything, or maybe there's a clinic down the road that does have a donor that meets your criteria, or maybe there's some compromise that
yeah,
you can have around that choice. So we know that there are people who get matched with a donor very quickly, and then there are other people that wait for a very long time. And as I said, that sometimes is to do with the matching criteria. Sometimes it is to do with shortages. I mean, we have to be honest. There is
mm,
because demand. I think I would probably see it more that demand has escalated,
okay.
and so that puts pressure on supply. Um, and I think obviously the last 18 months hasn't helped, with the clinics being
Yeah,
shut for some of that
does.
time, maybe
Yeah,
donors feeling uncomfortable putting themselves forward, maybe clinics not being able to even restart those programs yet.
yeah,
So yeah, it's complicated.
yeah. And what is the current situation with people looking for a donor from an ethnic minority background?
Well, they have to put the work in. I mean, it's a real, it's something that could I think be addressed. Not quite sure
Okay.
how, but I think the fact that all the clinics basically sort of operate independently and all the banks operate independently, it means that it can be very difficult. In theory, what you'd have to do is phone up all the clinics to find out who's got a donor that matches a criteria. Um, I think now that we've got the option of egg freezing for donors, it takes the pressure off a little bit. Whereas, before, because the donor would have to be sort of available at
Okay.
that moment.
Mm.
Whereas
Yeah.
now, if you've had if you've got a particular kind of donor, that can go in the bank and be ready for someone who might need it in the coming months or years. Um, but yes, I mean, ideally, it would be where you have slightly more unusual criteria or specific criteria that there'd be an easier way for you to find a match.
Yeah.
Some the clinics could perhaps
Yeah,
think.
that's understandable. Yeah. And we often hear that the ending of anonymity for donors has meant that less people are likely to donate. What are your feelings on that?
Well, I think first of all, it's not true.
Okay.
So actually, if you look at the numbers have pretty much gone up. I'm not sure about last year, but last year was
Mm,
unusual.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I think they've pretty much gone up year on year. And like I said, I think it's more that supply is the issue.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
demand is
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
issue. Demand is really outstripping supply, and that is a problem. And I think it's a bigger conversation that needs to be had about what are the what is the way to resolve that imbalance between
Mm,
UK supply and UK demand.
yeah.
And we probably need a bit of a public conversation around that, because donors are coming forward, and certainly
Yeah.
not the anonymity. Because one thing is you have to remember is that donors had no choice before. They
Yeah.
weren't asked, would you like to be anonymous? They were told
Yeah.
you have to be anonymous. And of course that
Okay.
suited many of them perfectly. But there were others who didn't feel comfortable. They wanted to know what happened next. They wanted to
Yeah.
be available if children had questions and wanted to know a bit more about their medical history, or about who this donor was, who was so important in the creation of that baby. And so they would have been very happy to be open about it, but that wasn't an option.
Mm. So I'm obviously guessing you'd love to see more people donate. What would you say, or what would you say to people if they're considering donating?
Yes, I mean I would, but I would want them to do it for them, not for me.
No,
As
sorry,
in,
yeah.
well, I suppose what I mean is, I think if there are people who are considering it, and perhaps why, if they're considering it, why does it not then end up happening? I mean, I have to also say that certainly for sperm donation, I'm not sure about egg donation, but it is really quite hard to be a sperm donor.
Mm,
I think people
okay.
don't realize, of the numbers that come forward saying they're willing, that there are so many hurdles that they have to get over. So just in terms of, medical history,
Right.
wider family background, psychological analysis, I think, this get asked all sorts of questions about themselves and their family, but then also the quality of the sperm, that may not be high enough, may not survive the freezing and defrosting process. So you have to recruit. You have to get a lot of men in
Um,
in order to get one donor at the end. So it is quite a tough process. And yeah, what would I say? I think I think the targeting of people who've had children of their own and who realize what a wonderful experience that is, to encourage them to perhaps, if they're the sort of person that feels that they can share that with other families, because some people don't. They feel very, very,
yeah.
that their eggs and sperm are theirs, and they feel like they're their children in to be, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Then they wouldn't be the right people to donate. But if they do have a sort of a sense that this is something they'd like to do, then maybe the clinics and banks we could work harder to facilitate that, to sort of make that an easier process
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah. hadn't even occurred to me about how difficult it might be for someone to donate sperm and to all those sort of barriers that they have to get through at the same time. Um,
Spoke to a sperm donor recently who was saying that he had encouraged, I think, four of his friends to donate, and none of them had managed to. They were all keen, but
oh
none of them
right,
had met the criteria. Uh,
goodness, yeah. Um, how easy is it at the moment for people to donate an embryo left over from their own treatment? And would you like to see that to be made easier?
I think that has potential for being a really great option because those embryos already exist. So you're not having to start with start from scratch, if you like.
Yeah,
There's something there ready, but it is different. So where you've got an embryo created by a couple, excuse me, then there is another family, and there are going to be full genetic siblings
yeah,
growing up in the family. And potentially, if the embryos are from the man and woman's own eggs and sperm, you've also got the two parents in that family raising those other children.
yeah.
So it is a little bit closer in some ways. And I think perhaps a different approach could be used there. I think it's much more sensible in that situation to consider a process whereby the couples or the individuals meet and
Okay,
have a sense of, okay, yes, we can have this sort of cousin sort of arrangement, so that for the children it's going to be such a close fit that thinking about that ahead, I think
yeah,
would make sense.
yeah.
But then, as I said, because those embryos exist, that could be a really really wonderful option for
Mm,
couples. We know couples who've got embryos in storage, they don't know what to do with them. They've seen what those embryos turn into when they look at their own children, so it's very hard for them to just not continue storing.
yeah,
But equally, they don't actually want more children. So what
yeah.
do they do?
So
But like,
what's the current process then when it comes to giving up an embryo?
well, do you know what? I'm not absolutely sure how easy that is. I suspect that different clinics have sort of slightly different protocols about how
Okay,
comfortable they feel around this.
yeah,
I know I think some clinics are more hesitant about it. Like they feel that there's something not quite, um,
yeah. I
you know,
can understand the
it's
difference.
because of that closeness. So
It's
whereas
very
I would
different.
say I
Yeah.
can see that the closeness could be a really, really wonderful benefit long term,
Mm,
but it perhaps needs a little bit of different handling at the beginning. But I think it makes the clinics a little bit cautious, which I
yeah.
which I can also understand.
Mm. So now many people are considering treatment overseas as an option because they see that they can find a donor more quickly and cheaply. And what advice would you have to them to consider before going ahead with this?
Yeah, lots of our members have had treatment abroad, and in fact, in the office, yes, more of our of the office team have had treatment abroad than in the UK, I think, or certainly have anonymous donors. So yes, I think it's it's so hard, isn't it? When you're particularly, I think for some people it's not that big an issue.
Mm,
um, the biggest difference is that you're working under a different legal framework.
mm,
So you just need to know what the country that you're having treatment, what is the legal framework there with regard to information about the donor, information about half siblings, potential contact in the future, record keeping, all of that sort of
yeah.
thing. So some countries, you won't get any information about the donor at all. I mean, you'll get, I think, age and eye color or age and height or something like that. That's
Mm,
it. Well, there's an awful lot more non-identifying information you could give about a person without giving them their name. Yeah,
yeah.
that might be very reassuring for parents to have a sense of, okay, what was their job, or what was their what were their coloring, what was their coloring, what was their nationality, maybe, just so that they can then turn that person, make that person a little bit more real for themselves and for their child, even if the donor is anonymous. So
Yeah.
that might be something that might make a difference for a parent in terms of what country they go to, and just thinking about how you're going to tell this story to your child. So I think the most important thing will be that the child feels that they're wanted, of course, that they're loved, and that they're growing up in a family which is open to have those conversations. And some children, when they grow up, may say, "Well, I want to know more about this donor person,"
Yeah.
and that could be a difficult conversation for a parent to say, "Well, I'm really sorry, but we don't know anything more about the person, and we're unlikely to ever get that information." But there are lots of things that we can't give our children that we would love to give our children, and there are lots of things that our children will be cross with us about, decisions that we've made, that they're not totally supportive of. That is part of family life. That's part of being a parent, and
Yeah.
you just have to be confident that you've thought it through, you've made the best decision for you, and that then things will unfold as they unfold, and we will provide lots of support for whatever scenario comes up. And there are children where it may just be of very little relevance. They might prefer it one way, but they're not really that bothered or that interested.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a tough one. I really feel for the for particularly for the parents where they would so like to stay in this country and they just can't afford it,
Yeah.
or can't, the donor is not available. And going back to the ethnicity question,
Mm.
that is a situation that some of those families find, is they end up having to have treatment abroad because they're obviously going to, more likely to find an Indian donor in India, and so that adds another layer of complexity. But
Yeah.
I think that the message we would give is, think things through, make decisions you can be confident in, get the support, come to an organization like DC Network so you can meet up with other people in a similar scenario. Your children can meet other children
Mm.
made sort of just like them, as we say it. But so that then, if things do, if challenges do come up, you've got a place to go to talk about them, and you've got a support network which can give really good advice and guidance. And then that's like a toolkit and a protective armor, for the future. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice. Um, so when it comes to sperm donors, we know that some women do choose the cheaper option of finding their own donor and sometimes online. And what would you advise in these circumstances?
um, I think just be careful, be cautious. You're working outside of the more regulated and protected space, which is partly why it costs more.
Mm.
So just be careful, be sensible, um, take your time, and make sure you've put some checks and balances of your own in place to make sure you're protected and your child is protected. Um, I mean, the things to think about, make sure you've met the person, and they're you trust them. You're going
Mm.
into a sort of a, a sort of contractual agreement with them, if you like. I would definitely write down what are your intentions and what are their intentions, so
Mm.
that it's clear whether this is a co-parenting arrangement, whether the donor is going to be available, at all. Is the donor expecting that they'll maybe see the child
Mm.
every month, every year? Is your intention that they will never meet until the child's 18 or older? And
Mm.
and also to think, like, how are you going to communicate with each other, and how are you going to um, how are you going to handle that relationship, arrangement? Because of course things change. You first, you need to trust that you're going into it in good faith, both sides, and secondly, things can change, so
Yeah.
feelings can change. Donors, we know sometimes, in those sort of arrangements, when they actually see a baby or a child, and it's a real person, it can be very difficult for them to be totally removed. They may suddenly say, "Oh, actually, I know we agreed that I'd just have an annual update. Actually, I'd quite like to make that, you know, 3 times a year."
Yeah.
Or I know we said I wouldn't see you. You just send me photographs, but actually, I'd like to see this.
Yeah.
So, how are you going to manage? How are you going to manage that? What are you going to do if they disappear? We've had the
Yeah.
other scenario where the donor makes an arrangement and then suddenly is totally uncontactable.
Yeah.
So just it's kind of getting that clarity. It can feel like a really simple choice and simple decision, but there's so much in it. Don't rush into
Yeah.
it.
And I
Get
guess,
get some advice.
yeah, that was going to be my suggestion as well. Come to your network, you chat to other people, get support, get counselling, and work through all those decisions with somebody else, just so that you can, yeah, get everything out and then process it. And just one final question: where do you see the future of donor conception in the UK?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I suppose it's where I see it and where I'd like it are two
Well,
different
yeah, okay,
questions.
go for
Um,
it.
yeah, I think it's it's clearly more and more people are choosing it as an option, and I think that in itself means we perhaps need a big public conversation. How do we want that industry
Yeah.
to work? And it feels like maybe the checks and balances that were put in place. Um, are they quite right? For example, in the UK, the fact that um, children can only have contact or information about the donor, or indeed about half siblings, so other children conceived with the help of the same donor, at the age of 18, and in some ways that feels a little bit arbitrary.
Yeah.
And that will be different for different families. So for some families, they will really want that hard edge, like you keep out of our life until we've established ourselves as a family. Once we're all adults, then we'll think about whether we want to
Yeah.
make connections or not. But for other people, they really want their children to grow up knowing potentially those half siblings, or at least being aware, like having a sense of who they are.
Yeah.
Similarly, donor. So I wonder whether that aged 18, what that means. And of course, in the age of DNA testing, home DNA testing, um,
Yeah.
you can put your DNA. I think it's 13 is the youngest, but I'm sure people are doing it earlier than that.
Mm.
But you can put your DNA into an ancestry website or something, and lots of connections are being made like that. Unintentional sometimes, but
Yeah.
intentional sometimes, and so it sort of makes a little bit of a mockery of those rules. And again, talking about what we were talking about before, I think the clinics could work a little bit more collaboratively in terms of donors. I understand, the ones that do such a good job of recruiting may feel a bit resentful of having to, support the ones who are being a bit more lazy and perhaps not not
Mm.
not investing so much in
Yeah.
their donor recruitment program. So there's got to be, some way to perhaps manage that. But I think having it, more slightly less hard boundaries between the donor, the parent recipient, and the child, and other children that have been created, sort of to try and make that little bit closer and more flexible,
Yeah.
so that people can have choices.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nina. You've given me so much to think about myself, and I thought I was relatively clued up on stuff. So it just goes to show how much there is to think about when considering donor conception. Thank you to everyone for joining us for the webinar this evening. The webinar is on our YouTube channel, and you can find the recording on our webinars page if you want to share it with others or watch again. We hope you enjoyed National Fertility Awareness Week webinars. We run webinars throughout the year, and you can find the recordings of them on our website. If you're wanting help or support, we're always here, and so are the Donor Conception Network. So whether it's via one of our support groups, a helpline, or via the resources on ours or their website, or if you'd like and you can afford to, no matter how small, donations always help us keep Fertility Network running. So thank you all. Thank you, Nina, and we'll see you all soon.